Good morning. I don't know how many of you will remember Brother Ira North. He, in 1977, when I met him, he was preacher for the church in Madison, Tennessee. Kathy and I were living in Madison at that time. He was teacher for the Amazing Grace Bible class, which many of you probably watched on television at the time. He, in 1978, would become editor of the Gospel Advocate and serve in that capacity for 2 years before Guyan Woods took it over. After services on a Wednesday night, in 1977, I went to the Madison church building to meet Brother North, sat down with him in his office, had some questions that I wanted to ask him. And he was very kind, he was very gracious, even though I was late getting there. Everybody had left, church building of 2,000 people, and he waited on me to show up and took me into his office. We sat there and we talked across his desk. And he handed me 2 items. One of them, a Bible with his name inscribed and date, which I still have. And he handed me 5 mites. And I have them here in this little plastic bag, and you'll see them on the PowerPoint slide behind me. At least I hope you will. He said, these mites, nowadays, he said, this was in 1977, so it's 45 years ago. He said, 5 of these equal 1 cent in our way of measuring things, monetary amount. 5 equals 1 penny. He said in Jesus' day, 4 equaled 1 penny, what we would call 1 penny. And he said, if you'll remember, the widow gave 2 of these mites, which means that she gave less than or about half a cent, monetarily speaking. And he said, sometime when you preach on the widow's mite, hold these things up and let people see them. Well, there they are. So I think 45 years is long enough to finally get that done. These things have stayed in a little box in my desk drawer all of that time. So, the widow's mite, or mites. And this is what they looked like in 1977. I don't have any ancient mites. I do have some ancient coins, but I don't have a mite. So that's as close as I can come to how they, or what they look like. In Luke chapter 20, in verse 44 through the end of the chapter, and spilling over into chapter 21, we get some insights into people. Some of them villains, some of them heroes. And the interesting thing about the Bible is, or one of the interesting things is that its heroes are not the kinds of people you would expect heroes to be. They're the most insignificant people that you can find. A lot like you and me. Just regular folks. And they stand out in ways that we would never ourselves discover. In fact, if it were not for Jesus, the account that we're reading this morning and thinking about this morning would never have been recorded. It would never have been read. It would never be known. It would never be thought about. We wouldn't learn anything about it. And we would never take home any lessons from it, were it not for Jesus. And because of Him, we are. And because of Him, the widow and her mites have been the subject matter of sermons many, many times over, and remain so today. I'm going to look at this passage briefly. And there are a couple of ways I'm going to approach it this morning from the standpoint of lessons that I want you to learn and me. And some of them are what I will call outward lessons. And by that I simply mean these are things that you will observe if you had been there, like Jesus observed. Jesus was a people watcher. And He observed the people that were here, watching what they were doing and talking about it. So, in terms of outward lessons, there are some obvious things that I hope you'll see. And then the flip side of that is that there are some inward lessons that we might never think about, except for the fact that Jesus points them out. Now, some of the outward lessons, just the obvious thing here as you read down through the text, and the Lord Himself points these things out. Number one, there are a group of people standing before Jesus who are known for their outward display. And I'm talking here about the scribes as they are identified. And Jesus does this for the benefit of His disciples. And the scribes are leaders among the Jews. And Jesus says certain things about them for the benefit of His disciples. And these things that Jesus says are not exactly complimentary, as you will note in verse 45 or verse 46. Beware of the scribes who desire to walk in long robes, love greetings in the marketplaces, and the best seats in the synagogues, and the best places at feasts. Well, this tells you all about them. Now, it's very easy for us to analyze the religious leaders of Jesus' day, the scribes and the Pharisees and the lawyers and all of that. And it's very easy for us to condemn, because we can hold them out there at arm's length, and they're way out there, and we're not like them, and they're not like us. But in reality, they are. So I want to try to dismiss from our minds the idea that, these guys are they're a different time and place, and Jesus had some hard things to say about them. But in reality, they're like us, because these men were leaders. These men were teachers. They were preachers. The people held them up. They honored them just like people do today. It's human nature for us to honor our preachers and our teachers. And we appreciate them. We pray for them. We exalt them in our own minds. We carry around in the back of our minds an analysis that so-and-so is the greatest preacher that has ever lived. So-and-so is the prince of preachers, and nobody else will ever measure up. And we put them up there on that pedestal and we keep them up there, and that's okay, I guess, until they fall off of it. And through some unfortunate circumstance, somehow or another, we discover that these preachers have feet of clay just like the rest of us do. And we react very strongly when we find it out. And we think, how can that be? But it is. They're like the rest of us. And Jesus puts these leaders up there and holds them up, not for honor, but for reality's sake, to point out pride. That's the common lesson. And that is what's outwardly on display in view of what he says in verse 46, but I'll come back to that in a moment. But also in verse 47, something about these leaders that Jesus points out that most people probably wouldn't know is that they devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers, and because of that, they will receive the greater condemnation. Okay? How do they devour widows' houses? And why widows? Widows exemplify the most vulnerable people of society. And these leaders devour their houses. How? We're not told, and I wouldn't pretend to know. But Jesus says they do this undercover, but out there in front of you all, they offer long and wordy prayers, and people think, wow, the longer, the better. The more spiritual, the greater these men are. And that's how you see them, you see. So yes, there's display, and then there's hypocrisy. These are the common lessons, the apparent things that Jesus points out as an observer of people. And then, in view of the circumstances and the situation, here are people in the confines of the temple, and they're making contributions. And Josephus tells us that in the temple there were a number of trumpet-shaped depositories in which people dropped their coins. And he says in the court of the women there were 13 trumpet-shaped depositories there, and people just dropped their money in them. And Jesus is observing all of this, and people are there contributing, and that's good. Out of the kindness of their heart, and out of their generosity, they're giving. And, I would take nothing away from that. And Jesus points it out. And again, in verse 1, he looked up. He saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury as they walked by, dropping their ancient coins in them. But he also noticed a certain poor widow putting in 2 mites. Would anybody else notice this widow? I don't know. They might. But Jesus observed that she dropped in 2 mites. Now, a mite, I've already explained to you, didn't amount to much. And 2 of them certainly didn't amount to much. And he mentions the real value of that later on, because that's all she had. But these other people, bless their hearts, they gave out of their abundance in verse 4. And they did so in offerings to God, but she out of her poverty gave all that she had. So here are contributions that are being made, and again, that's an outward thing. Anybody would see that. Nothing hidden there. So what does all of this suggest to us? Well, it suggests a few things. Number one, in verses 45 and 46 and 47, Jesus points out their pride. the pride of the religious leaders. And pride is a very difficult thing to overcome, especially if you're a high achiever. You've got to work at it, not to let it go to your head. And not to let it work on you to the point that you think whatever you're able to accomplish, it's because you did it. It's not to God's glory, and it's not in your own mind because you're a steward in God's kingdom, and He's using you, and you're using your talents and abilities to serve Him. It's none of that. It's look at what I've done. And I am great, by the way. That's pride, and that's a hard thing to overcome. And Jesus points that out here. And He does so knowing that this is one of the last opportunities that He will have to put His disciples on notice and to warn them of people like this. And He does so knowing full well that as He says this, He's feeding the hatred of the religious elite against Him. And within a matter of a few days, they'll put Him to death. But it didn't stop Him, did it? So here's pride. And then something else that stands out for us in terms of these outward lessons is, very obviously, there are two classes of givers here. There's the rich and there's the poor. There's no middle class. We consider ourselves middle-class people, just average individuals. But in Jesus' situation here, you've got the rich and you've got the poor. And, that was basically it. And we'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But in fact, the fact that this poor widow here dropped 2 mites into the treasury tells you that there's no one who is too poor to give. I wonder how many of us come in here on the Lord's Day and we're told that there are baskets back there by the doors. You could leave your contribution. But we don't bring one. We don't leave one. Because we consider ourselves too poor. We only have one job and we don't make a great deal. And we don't think about contributing on the Lord's Day because we think we're too poor. You're not too poor. Nobody is. Anybody can give. If this lady can give, anybody can give. All right? And that stands out to us. Outward lessons that are obvious. Anybody could see these. But then there are the inward lessons that Jesus points out. Because He's the Son of God, and He analyzes this situation for us. The fact that there are two types of givers. That there are those people who, God bless them, give out of their abundance, just like these people did here. And Luke calls them rich. Jesus calls them rich. You say, well, I'm not rich. Well, in reality you are. But in contrast to that, you got the poor. And all that tells you is that there are two kinds of contribution. There are those who give out of their abundance, and there's more where that came from. And there are those who, like this widow, give all they've got. And for her, that meant no trip to the store today. No bread, no milk today. That's what it meant to her. Because she gave all she had. Now, there are two types of contributions. And both of them are appreciated. Because one of them amounts to dollars and cents. One of them is what church budgets are made of. And we've got to have that in order to serve and to function. And the other one will never be noticed, but it means more than any dollar amount in the world. And the only reason I'm able to say that is because Jesus points that out. And another inward lesson that comes out of this is because He's the Son of God, Jesus teaches us that God doesn't see things the way we do. We see things in terms of dollars and cents. Jesus sees things in terms of the heart. So where we count, God weighs. He weighs the heart. He sees the evil intent and He sees the good. And He weighs that. So God doesn't see it the way I see it. And I'm to learn something from that. And there's a spirit here of giving that Jesus isolates. And He brings that out. You say, this poor widow, she put in more than all these other people combined in verse 3. Because out of their abundance they give, and God bless them because they can. But she, out of her poverty, has put in all of her livelihood, all that she had. Well, there's a spirit there, and I would call it the spirit of generosity and the spirit of willingness. And I think Paul taps into this in 2 Corinthians chapter 9. Because Paul is writing to the church at Corinth here, and he said, look, I've been bragging about you to the brethren at Macedonia, and I don't want you to disappoint me. I've been telling them what you people are like there at Corinth. In verse 5, I'm going to back up to verse 5. I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren to go to you ahead of time, prepare your bountiful gift beforehand, which you have previously promised, that it may be ready as a matter of generosity and not as a grudging obligation. All right, you see that? There's generosity on the one hand. There's grudging obligation on the other. Okay? Now follow on verse 6. But this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. He who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. And let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. We apply that to our giving today, and properly so. Because if you drop something in the basket back yonder, but you hate turning loose of it, there goes half the value of it right there. Somebody says, well, the dollar amount, that's pretty good. Doesn't matter. The spirit is wrong. And there goes most of the value right there. So there's a spirit involved here. Paul taps into it, and he does so for the benefit of churches like Mablevale, to help them in their giving, to help us all. So yeah, it's there. And then there's the matter of sacrifice, and I've already pointed out to you, going back to this, these people that cast in much, they didn't miss it a whole lot. There's more where that came from. But for the poor widow, no trip to the store that day. Something to think about, isn't it? Now, I wanted you to look at this. I know it's familiar to you. I know you've heard it many times. But I wanted you to look at it from the standpoint of thinking about the persons involved and how they relate to you or how you relate to them. Do you relate to the scribes here who are offset by their pride? Do you relate to the wealthy individuals who contribute out of their abundance because you've got plenty and you're able to help the church here and we need you? Or do you relate to the widow who out of what little she had gave it all? Now, look at all of that and think about it. And do some comparison, do some heart searching. That's why the scriptures are written, to help us do that. Where do you fit in all of that? And if you don't like the answer to your heart-searching question, well, all right, you can do something about that. You can change it. You can do that. But if you do like the answer, you think you're okay, and you're giving, supporting, encouraging the work, I'm not going to beat up on you. Far be it from me. Just keep it up. Continue serving sacrificially to give to the Lord and His church. Don't stop it. Now, years ago, we had an elder here who told me he wanted me to preach on giving every year. And I did. It's been a while. He's been gone a long time. But he wanted that. And then we have another who said, every time I do, the contribution goes down. Oh, life is tough. Yeah. Isn't that the way it is? But I just want to leave you with this. Look at these people. Where do you fit in? You might not like the answer, or you might. That's okay too. And if changes need to be made, make them. And that's what keeps us going, isn't it? We're always changing, always growing, proving, getting closer to God is the way it should be. So think about it, contemplate it, and work it over in your heart, and get yourself closer to God. Walk with Him. But you got to start that walk. I know people who have a long time ago started that walk, and some who haven't. And I'm appealing to you now, if you haven't, step out there and walk with God through Jesus. Okay? There's no other way. You do it through obeying the gospel. Okay? Buried with Him in baptism, risen a new creature. And what we've read here this morning is part of the total package. And I encourage you to do that while we stand and sing.